My name is Kamau, and this is an expert witness report. Factual summary. Army Sergeant Carlos Martin reported a Richland County Sheriff deputy falsely arrested him and subjected him to physical abuse. Martin was arrested for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. His wife was also arrested. At the time of the contact, Sergeant Martin was stationed at the Fort Richardson military base in Columbia, South Carolina. The following is a shortened summary of reports and documents reviewed for this report. Arrest reports written by the officers, deposition and trial testimony transcripts, photographs of the crime scene, witness interviews and statements. Staff assigned to this case investigation: 2 licensed private investigators, a paralegal, and a federal civil rights attorney were consulted for this case. Approximate number of hours dedicated to review of materials in this matter, 80 hours. Reporting Officer Ben Fields was dispatched to a call in reference to a suspicious individual hanging around. While Reporting Officer was in the area, Reporting Officer could hear loud music being played by someone in the apartment complex. After about a minute or so, a white Ford Explorer came driving around the corner playing extremely loud, and the subject even looked at the Reporting Officer and continued to play it loud. Reporting Officer then turned his patrol car around and got out to make contact with subject C. Martin, who had already gotten out of his car, was asked by Reporting Officer to come over and present ID. C. Martin looked at Reporting Officer and stated very loudly with profanity, "What for?" Reporting Officer advised C. Martin that his music was entirely too loud and that you need to present an ID because Reporting Officer was going to ticket him for county noise ordinance. C. Martin continued to be loud and boisterous towards Reporting Officer, cursing and calling Reporting Officer racist. At this time, several neighbors had gathered outside of the investigative location area. Reporting Officer advised C. Martin to calm down, and C. Martin, in an irate fashion, did give Reporting Officer a military ID. Reporting Officer finally told C. Martin to calm down or he was going to jail for breach of the peace. C. Martin again responded loudly and cursing that Reporting Officer would not arrest him. At this time, Reporting Officer told C. Martin he was under arrest for breach of the peace and to place his hands behind his back. C. Martin turned around and Reporting Officer placed one cuff on his right arm. Then C. Martin tried to pull away from the Reporting Officer and began kicking and swinging his left arm around, striking Reporting Officer on the left leg and in the left arm. Reporting Officer then took C. Martin to the ground while giving C. Martin loud verbal commands over and over again to stop resisting and get your hands behind your back. At this time, about 15 to 20 people had gathered, and C. Martin's wife, T. Martin, came outside with her camera phone and began taking pictures of Reporting Officer on top of C. Martin. T. Martin was also yelling and cursing at Reporting Officer. Reporting Officer told her to back up or she was going to jail. Reporting Officer did call for backup. Also, extra units were en route. Reporting Officer advised C. Martin again to put his hands behind his back. C. Martin responded no, and Reporting Officer did spray him with capstan in the head. C. Martin still did not comply, and Reporting Officer gave him 2 strikes to the right side of his body. Finally, Reporting Officer Clark and Reporting Officer Smith got there and C. Martin was handcuffed. At that time, T. Martin came running outside, cursing and yelling, swinging at Reporting Officer Clark and Reporting Officer Smith and Reporting Officer Fields. Reporting Officer Fields stated, "You're under arrest for breach of peace," and went to place handcuffs on T. Martin. She began hitting and kicking Reporting Officer all over. Reporting Officer Fields restrained her and took her to the ground and handcuffed her. Both subjects were looked at by EMS but refused medical. Reporting Officer Fields and Reporting Officer Clark had cuts on their hands. The cell phone was taken for evidence and put in RCS drop box. Sergeant Carlos Martin tells a much different story. He reports that the incident started when he left the Fort Jackson military base in Columbia, South Carolina, headed home. Sergeant Martin left the base after completing his duties and traveled to his home a few miles away. As he pulled into his apartment complex, he noticed a police unit driven by Deputy Ben Fields. Martin says he acknowledged the deputy by tipping his head as he passed in a friendly manner. Martin would later learn through Deputy Fields' courtroom testimony that the deputy was insulted by the gesture and perceived it as hostile. Sergeant Martin reports that he cooperated with the deputy's every request. Martin said that he provided the deputy with 3 different forms of military ID upon request. Sergeant Martin says he became exasperated when the deputy asked several of the same questions over again and demanded additional ID. According to Martin, he commented to the deputy that he had provided sufficient ID and referred to the deputy in a passing remark as dude. The deputy informed Carlos Martin that he could not speak to a Richland County Sheriff deputy in a disrespectful manner. According to Martin, without further warning, the deputy attacked him, striking him several times after knocking him to the ground. When the attack began, Carlos Martin was in full military uniform. After being knocked down, Sergeant Martin lay curled upon the ground, protecting his body consistent with his military training. Officer Fields then escalated the assault. The deputy began spraying Martin in the face with a chemical mace. According to Martin, the deputy's anger increased as Martin's military training prevented the mace from having an immediate effect. During the assault, Martin states that Deputy Fields used a number of racial slurs and taunts. During the criminal trial, under cross-examination, Deputy Fields admitted making racially derogatory and offensive remarks. According to Martin, one of the remarks included a comment that Fields was pleased that famed defense attorney Johnny Cochran was dead. According to Martin, his wife was groped and searched by 3 male officers, without a female officer present. Sergeant Martin states that he told Deputy Fields that he had private marital pictures on his wife's cell phone. Deputy Fields offered to return the phone if he was allowed to delete all the phone content. Martin refused to agree. Fields deleted the phone's content, destroying valuable evidence. Our review of this case demonstrates that Deputy Fields was operating illegally after his initial contact with Sergeant Carlos Martin. Deputy Fields wrote in his report that after requesting Sergeant Martin's ID, Martin provided ID, though he did so in what the deputy describes as an irate fashion. Police officers may request identification during any subject stop. However, no citizen is ever required to talk to the police. And though Deputy Fields did not like the sound of Martin's comments, the comments themselves are not illegal and should not have led to the use of force. When Carlos Martin supplied the requested identification, the officer had no basis to escalate this situation to an arrest. Though the officer stated that Sergeant Martin could be arrested for breach of the peace, no one's peace was at risk of being disturbed except for the deputies. At the heart of this case is what's known in police subculture as an attitude arrest. Deputy Fields did not like Carlos Martin's attitude. Though no crime had been committed and no crime had been reported, Deputy Fields created a crime in order to arrest Sergeant Martin for his attitude. He used breach of peace, assault on a police officer, and a non-existent noise violation to justify his conduct and choice of action. According to court transcripts, Fields had no legal reason to contact Sergeant Carlos Martin. Martin could legally resist Fields according to the trial judge. There was no probable cause for the contact with Carlos Martin according to a court of proper jurisdiction. Any use of force against Martin or his wife would therefore be inappropriate, unsanctioned, and not covered by police policies applicable under conditions where the officer's conduct is lawful. This is what the trial judge stated after reviewing this case and hearing the evidence. I think the state of the case law in South Carolina is that a citizen has the right to resist unlawful arrest, and so to the extent that there was an attempt to arrest Carlos Martin for breach of peace, I find the breach of peace did not occur, and there was no probable cause in order to arrest him for breach of peace, and therefore he was within his rights to resist arrest on that basis, and therefore I will grant the motion for a directed verdict." End quote. An independent witness also confirmed through court testimony that there was no loud music or noise before Deputy Fields arrested Carlos Martin. The witness was the mother of a police officer who lived above Carlos Martin. In his own courtroom testimony, Deputy Fields admitted that there was never any noise at the apartment complex, nor was there ever a noise complaint received as a call by the Richland County Sheriff's Office, as he falsely wrote in his report. In response to a question posed by Carlos Martin's attorney, Fields answered accordingly. "When you saw him, did you hear any music?" Answer by Deputy Fields, "No." Opinions and conclusions. It is my professional opinion, to a reasonable degree of professional certainty, that Deputy Ben Fields violated several standards of conduct and training consistent with universally accepted practices related to the performance of law enforcement officers' duties. Based on the evidence, it is clear that Deputy Fields not only subjected two innocent people to excessive force, but that he attempted to cover up his conduct by falsely accusing the arrested citizens of criminal conduct. Specifically, Fields accused Carlos Martin of the following during their encounter: playing loud music, cursing at a police officer, resisting arrest, striking a police officer. There is significant evidence and courtroom testimony that these allegations are false and were generated by the officer to justify his own irrational conduct and his misuse of police authority. According to Deputy Fields, upon first contact with Carlos Martin, Sergeant Martin is accused of using profanity. However, a review of Deputy Fields' police report demonstrates that the officer never describes what the profanity used actually was. This omission is extraordinary. Police officers are trained to write factually descriptive reports. The reports must be detailed because the reports are relied on for further investigation and criminal prosecutions. Consequently, to assist prosecutors and detectives, police reports must include all relevant facts and details. The allegation that Sergeant Martin was using profanity is central to this case, yet it is never described. Police officers are trained to overlook the niceties that a layperson might consider when writing a report. Police reports must include language consistent with the officer's memory of the event, even if the language includes profanity. Fields' report is inconsistent with professional standards of police report writing. I believe that if Carlos Martin had actually used profanity as described by the deputy, it would have strengthened the deputy's allegations. Because Martin's words would have been evidence against him, there is little doubt that his direct quotes would have been included in the police report under normal circumstances. In my view, the deputy was reluctant to describe the profanity in detail because it is a false statement. It did not occur. While the deputy was willing to exaggerate Martin's conduct in his police report, he did not want to risk perjuring himself under the scrutiny of a trial judge and defense attorney. My opinion on this issue is supported by other discrepancies in the deputy's official police report. Deputy Fields stated that his reason for approaching Carlos Martin was loud noise. Yet later he retreated from this position during his trial testimony, admitting that there was in fact no noise present when he arrived. This contradiction and others led the trial judge to criticize the officer's arrest and point out that the arrest was not legal. The inconsistencies and obvious false statements had a similar impact on my conclusion that the deputy's report is utterly incredible and not to be relied on as evidence of Sergeant Martin's purported criminal conduct. A second substantial contradiction to the officer's report appears in his justification for the arrest of Sergeant Martin's wife. In his report, on the third page, line number 8, Deputy Fields states that soon after he contacted Sergeant Martin, a crowd of 15 to 20 people had gathered. T. Martin, Sergeant Martin's wife, allegedly came out of the residence and began filming the officer as he straddled her husband's back. Fields claims that the wife was hostile and cursing. The deputy implies that she was interfering, thereby justifying his subsequent arrest of Sergeant Martin's wife. But later, in the same police report, the deputy claims that Martin's wife arrived at the incident at a different time. On page 3, line 16, Deputy Fields states that after Sergeant Martin was handcuffed, T. Martin then came running outside, cursing, yelling, and swinging at reporting officers Clark, Smith, and Fields. Now, either Sergeant Martin's wife appeared before the fight started, or she arrived after the fight was over, but she could not be in both places at the same time as described in the officer's report. The officer provides almost no detail about his arrest of Mrs. Martin. The fact that she may have been yelling and screaming is understandable given that her husband had just arrived home from work and was being attacked by a police officer in his own front yard for no apparent reason. Remember, there was no noise violation, and Sergeant Martin was behaving legally when the officer contacted him. I believe that the officer arrested Mr. Martin's wife to ensure that he would have control over the video that Mrs. Martin had just recorded. I have taken some time to examine the deputy's characterization of Carlos Martin's demeanor. Deputy Fields stresses in his report that the Martins were hostile and belligerent. This framing is frequently used by police officers to justify their own use of force where force may not have been necessary at all. Any use of force must be consistent with police department policy. Most police department policies make it clear that force must be used proportionately, consistent with the offender's conduct. Police officers understand the relationship between a suspect's alleged aggression and the appropriate use of force. Officers know that their use of force can be considered excessive if they cannot justify their conduct within the confines of police policies. Because Deputy Fields used an exceptional amount of force and violence in his arrest of Carlos Martin, quote, several knee strikes and the use of chemical mace, his police report needed to comport with his actions. Describing Carlos Martin as menacing and threatening was vital to the officer's own alibi, protecting him from allegations of excessive force and possible criminal prosecution. In the report, it appears that Deputy Fields goes out of his way to enhance and exaggerate Carlos Martin's conduct to justify his own behavior. I do not believe the officer's report as it relates to the accusations of assault and resisting arrest. It appears that Deputy Fields adjusted the facts to support his own conduct. We uncovered a substantial amount of independent evidence attesting to Sergeant Martin's actual demeanor and social circumstances prior to this incident. For example, Sergeant Carlos Martin was cited in his military unit as Officer of the Month 2 times before his encounter with Deputy Fields in the same year. He had a record of service in the community, including sports mentoring to young children and a myriad of other social services related to activities in the community. According to witnesses we interviewed who are familiar with his temperament and demeanor, Martin is a very mild-mannered and quiet individual who gets along well with others. If Sergeant Carlos Martin were a troublemaker, it is doubtful he would have risen to the position and rank of sergeant in the U.S. military. Moreover, his reputation in the community would be much different than that of a good citizen, as we were repeatedly told by other residents in the same community. Other facts raise doubts about the deputy's report. Sergeant Carlos Martin is much smaller than Deputy Ben Fields, I would say by at least 100 pounds. Fields is a bodybuilder with a significant weight and size advantage over Carlos Martin. One is asked to believe that Sergeant Martin repeatedly provoked a fight with a much larger man for no apparent reason. After first nodding and acknowledging the officer, Sergeant Martin allegedly becomes belligerent without explanation. Fields is unable to recall any of the hostile, profane words that Martin allegedly used. According to the trial judge, even if Sergeant Martin did use violence in response to the conduct of Deputy Fields, he would have been within his rights to do so. The arrest and conduct of Deputy Fields prior to the arrest falls squarely outside of the accepted standards of conduct and practices for law enforcement personnel in similar circumstances. There are several reasons that this officer is not to be believed. Among them, the officer was caught making a false report. During trial cross-examination, he admitted using racial slurs. and the trial judge affirmed that he had no probable cause for his contact with Carlos Martin. Given the substantial evidence weighted against the officer's credibility, there is no reason to believe anything that he wrote in his report. The report appears constructed to aid the officer in covering up a number of serious crimes, including assault and battery, knowingly writing a false government document, and destruction of evidence. It is my professional opinion that the deputy lost his temper after a perceived insult and attacked an innocent citizen who had done nothing wrong. The deputy had to arrest Martin's wife and falsely accuse her of crimes she did not commit because she had recorded him on her cell phone. The deputy destroyed evidence that would have implicated him in the crime when he deleted the cell phone content. He had no permission to do so from the phone's owner and should have been reprimanded from his department for destruction of personal property. It is clear that the deputy was working to protect himself by destroying this evidence. The deputy had no search warrant and should not have even been allowed to examine the phone's content. This conduct is consistent with police cover-ups we have investigated in the past. Police officers accused of crimes often attempt to destroy evidence before it reaches investigators. It is worth remembering that Carlos Martin was entering his own home at the time of this attack. He was in full military uniform. Our review of the evidence in this case indicates that Sergeant Martin did his best to comply with the deputy's request for identification. As noted, the trial judge stated there was no basis for contact with Martin under the conditions described in the deputy's report. Sergeant Martin was wrongfully detained, and there had been no crime committed when he was contacted by Officer Ben Fields. As a retired police detective with several thousand contacts, in my experience, I can conclusively say that I would not have approached Mr. Martin in this manner under these circumstances. According to standards set by the International Association of Chiefs of Police model policy, force may only be used by officers to overcome resistance during an arrest or to protect citizens and officers. The force must be reasonable and necessary. Neither of these conditions were present in the use of force against Carlos Martin. The force was not being used to protect citizens or officers from any real threat. It appears that Deputy Fields attacked Carlos Martin out of anger related to their verbal exchange and not for a legitimate law enforcement reason. The trial judge put it as simply as possible. There was no breach of the peace. It is clear that the deputy did not testify consistently with his reports. On its face, there's enough evidence for the Richland County Sheriff's Office to have requested a criminal prosecution of this officer for writing a false police report. As best I can determine, no such action took place. Moreover, subsequent requests for complaints directed against Deputy Fields have resulted in hostile and offensive comments coming from the Sheriff's Office and the Sheriff himself. Carlos Martin's mother attempted to report a complaint about Deputy Ben Fields. She was told by Sheriff Leon Lott never to call his office again. She has never been given any answers regarding the abuse of her son. Similarly, Carlos Martin received a letter from the Sheriff's Office explaining that they conducted their own investigation, but they would not reveal any disciplinary actions taken against Deputy Ben Fields. It is my professional opinion that Richland County Sheriff Deputy Benjamin Fields violated the following policies: conduct during subject stops, arrest procedures, field interview practices, use of force, use of a chemical agent, use of handcuffs, general standards of police report writing, truthful and honest courtroom testimony, and standards of general conduct by police officers. We have referred this report to the FBI for review, and we have requested a subsequent investigation by the FBI and the United States Justice Department for civil rights violations. We have learned that Deputy Fields is assigned to Spring Valley High School, where he regularly has interactions with young people of all races. Given his propensity for violence and his explosive temper, this is a recipe for new incidents of violence. We are formally requesting that the school district consider reassigning this officer to a position away from direct contact with students pending a full review of his prior violent conduct.